Hello, welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. On this episode, I am very honored and very privileged to bring you the conversation I had with Sven Beckert. Sven is the Laird Bell Professor of History at Harvard University. His research and teaching center on the history of the United States in the 19th century, with a particular emphasis on the history of capitalism, including its economic, social, political, and global dimensions. He is the co-chair of the program on the study of capitalism at Harvard. He's also the co-chair of the Weatherhead Initiative on Global History, and he is the co-editor of a series of books at Princeton University Press on America and the world. His work has been supported by the Guggenheim Foundation, the American Council of Learned Societies, the Humboldt Foundation, the Netherlands Institute for Advanced Studies, and the New York Public Library Center for Scholars and Writers. He is the author of the latest book, Capitalism, A Global History. And as I mentioned in the conversation, it is a tome. It is a masterpiece. It is a large book. It is clocks over 1,300 pages. Of course, there's a couple hundred pages of notes there, but it's at least 1,100 pages of content. And appropriate if you're writing about 1,000 years of history about capitalism around the world. So it's a big book, but as I say in the conversation, very readable. It's not this, dense, technical, economic kinds of jargon. Of course, there are some in there. And it's not entirely just history either. It's a really, really good mix and balance of both. I really did enjoy reading the book, and very, very fortunate to talk to Sven. He was very lovely in conversation, and really, really, we got to, I think, the biggest themes in the heart of many of the issues. Of course, we did not cover in 1 hour 1,300 pages, 1,000 years of history, so I highly encourage folks to pick up the book. We start by talking about how capitalism has always been global. We give some definition of capitalism. We talk about the positive and negative aspects of capitalism, where the origins of capitalism are, and how trading from a distance was a key factor early on. We also talk about the impact of the Muslim world in the early stages of capitalism, and how the Muslim world was very, very big with trade. We talk about capitalism within the state, how the state really is impactful on capitalism, and also in the countryside. We talk about slavery and capitalism and that relationship throughout history, the rise of a working class and what that looked like for capitalism. Of course, we talk about wealth and income inequality, capitalism in the 21st century, and many other topics. Again, I thoroughly enjoy this conversation. Sven is obviously brilliant, and the book is just great. So big privilege. Of course, you can always find this conversation and all other conversations at convergingdialogues.substack.com, also on YouTube. So get over there to the Substack, subscribe, share with your friends. And now I bring you Sven Beckert. I am here with Sven Beckert. Sven, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. Big honor, big privilege, and I'm excited to talk with you.
Great to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. So you have written an absolute tome, a masterpiece, a new masterpiece. The book is Capitalism, A Global History. Very ambitious. This is out through the wonderful Penguin Press. And I think the final page amount I saw was 1,344 pages. So a small book. Yeah. I guess if you're writing a global history, it has to be over 1,000. That has to be a requirement somewhere. So we'll talk all about it and how you came to write the book and stuff. But before we do, tell listeners just kind of who you are professionally, academically, and relevant details.
So I'm Sven Beckert. I'm a professor of history at Harvard University, and I teach mostly the history of the United States, but my interests have been for a very long time focused on the history of capitalism. I've written a history of economic elites in New York City, the merchants and bankers and industrialists of New York City in the 19th century. I have written another global history, a global history of cotton, that tries to understand how we think through the history of capitalism, through the history of one particular commodity. And when I was done with that, understood that cotton is important to capitalism, but there's more to capitalism than cotton, and thus I embarked upon writing this very long, but I think a book that I think is also kind of fun to read.
Yes, I will definitely say that. Let me just say, Empire of Cotton won the Bancroft Prize and was a finalist for the Pulitzer. So another fabulous book, which people should check out. So about this one. So I will just say this. So I read the whole thing. I did my due diligence.
Thank you.
And it was. I like big books, so it's not really intimidating for me. But I can imagine some people will be like, "Oof, I need to, take a holiday to read a book over 1,000 pages." It is. I mean, you're a great writer, but I was, I'm not deep in finance and economics, but I was really kind of surprised at how readable it is. It is not overly dense. It's not with. I've read economic books and they're kind of jargony and they're kind of a bit much. But this was very readable, very clear. A lot of reminders of okay, so here's what we're discussing in this period. Here's what the big thing is here. Like it's I'm being a little bit colloquial here, but it's very much in a very readable way. And then even when explaining some of the details, I never got lost. It was very clear, very readable throughout, and obviously with so much rich data information. So I mean, well done. I mean, it was very good. It was very good.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate that. And this was also when I set out to write this book. I wanted to write a book that is not primarily addressed to my colleagues in the economics department, or is even primarily addressed to my colleagues in the history department, or even primarily addressed to my history students. But it was supposed to be a book, and I'm happy to hear that it might have become that book, that is really accessible to anyone who is interested in thinking about the world we live in today, and also how we got to where we are right now. And the starting point of the book is basically the idea that we live in capitalism today. Much of our lives are influenced by and structured by what I call the capitalist revolution. And it's so prevalent, it's so much all around us that sometimes it's very hard for us to see it. It's almost like fish in water. We live in capitalism, but it's very hard to see it and very hard to understand it. At the same time, everybody has an opinion on capitalism. Some people hate it. Some people think it's the greatest thing that ever happened to humanity. But often these kind of strong opinions are not necessarily backed up by great knowledge about capitalism as such and how we got to where we are. And so this book is supposed to basically explain to us how we got to the point where we are right now, how this capitalist revolution unfolded over the past 1,000 years. And I think looking at that history is of course important in its own right, because we understand that history then in a different light and perhaps much better. But it also does show us that capitalism is not the natural order of things, A, and B, capitalism has changed drastically in the past 500 or in the past 1,000 years. And it is an economic order that is a radical departure from prior human history. But it's an economic order that didn't fall out of the sky, but it's an economic order that was created by us and by our ancestors. And thus, it's also an economic order that will change into the future, and we are kind of the architects of that future as well. But in order to be those architects, we need to understand how we got to where we are right now.
Yeah, you lay it out nicely, and one of the things you say early in the book is you're not making a critique of capitalism, but you're not also, it's not a puff piece either, right? That there are many elements of capitalism that have negative and positive components, but it is an you're right. Obviously, we live in it, right? It's right. The fish analogy is apt. We've never not lived in a time in the modern age at the moment, with generations of people haven't had some form of capitalism. So it's almost hard to imagine another way in the modern age globally of how to do a system, because it's kind of always been capitalism for us modern folks. But I guess to kind of dive into some of the big themes, and we'll talk about some of the big periods. You cover about 1,000 years up to the modern point, which is nice. I think the last chapter goes to 2008. So you talk about capitalism, and this comes up through various periods throughout the 1,000 years, is these two stories of capitalism, right? One on increasing wealth and rising output, but then this other darker underbelly of exploitation, violence, and misery. And obviously there's a big piece of that in the 18th and 19th centuries, so we'll get there. But yeah, how does one question I was having as I was reading the book was, can we see capitalism without that kind of darker underbelly? Like, it does feel like it is endogenous to capitalism, of saying, like, to have these things, to have output, to have wealth, to have all these things, it is a lot of the times on exploitive practices. And maybe that's too sharp of a distinction to be made, but yeah, tell us about these sort of two stories of how capitalism functions throughout time.
Yes, so as you say, the book is not primarily motivated by, explaining that the history is right or is wrong, that capitalism is good or capitalism is bad. It's really an effort to understand it and how it unfolded over the past 1,000 years, and to give you the tools that you need to kind of navigate the present. And of course, as you also said, people have told two kind of opposing stories about capitalism. One story that is frequently told is that, and this is certainly a story that is accurate, that capitalism has led to an explosion of human productivity. We produce so much more than we produced 50 years ago, and even more radically more than we produced 500 years ago. We have become much wealthier. We have become much healthier. There are many more of us. And this is certainly, this kind of revolution in productivity is certainly unique to capitalism. There were other forms of organizing economic life in the past. European feudalism, for example, that produced great wealth too, but it never resulted in the kind of productivity gains that capitalism has resulted in. So this is one story that we can tell about capitalism, and that is certainly historically accurate and quite legitimate. And then we can tell another story that you also already mentioned, in which we focus on, the expansion of plantation slavery in the Caribbean, which was really quite important to the takeoff of capitalism. We can focus on the immiseration of workers in the British cotton textile industry, and we can take all of that all the way to the present and think about, child labor in Congo mining, or thinking about the children who harvest cotton in Uzbekistan, or we can think about the ill-paid workers in the textile industry of Cambodia today. So these, we need to see that both of these stories are part of the history of capitalism. And your question, okay, can we imagine capitalism without the dark side? I don't know. I even though I've studied this for 30 years, I cannot tell you. And in some ways, this is not the prime question that I'm interested in, because what I try to do is to show how capitalism actually unfolded, not how it should have unfolded, how it possibly could have unfolded, how the traditional economics textbook would explain to you how it does unfold, allegedly. But I'm writing the history of it, and I'm trying to understand how all of these things related to one another and produce the world in which we live in right now. And so that also goes back to a point that you made earlier. This is not an effort to understand kind of on an abstract level how capitalism works, like you would find in any economics textbook or in a Marxist treatise. That is not what I'm interested in. I'm interested in the history of actually existing capitalism, the actual history of capitalism as it unfolded. And as anybody who reads this book will see, capitalism historically unfolded in ways that was quite unlike how it is predicted in the economics textbook that you might have encountered when you took macro or microeconomics in college.
Yeah, no, that's very nice. Well, I appreciate that. Throughout the book, as I was reading it, it didn't feel like a kind of agenda. It's just saying this is how it unfolded. Whether it should have or shouldn't. That's for another kind of book or whatever.
Yeah.
Okay, so you two kind of just starting out points just to kind of get them out of the way. How do you define capitalism? I mean, you don't spend a lot of time on it, thankfully. I kind of find definitional kind of arguments a little boring. But just to kind of, a kind of foundational thing of, how do you, as you're talking about capitalism, what's a general definition and maybe how that evolves? And then, how do we kind of see, in the beginning of the book, you talk about Aden, which is modern day Yemen in the 12th century. I mean, again, there's not like in 1052 is when capitalism started. It's not like that, but how do we start to see where, okay, this is different. This is where this is kind of something different from the previous kind of, if you will, economic system. So what's the kind of operational definition, and then where do we start to see the origins of capitalism as a kind of thing that starts to build and evolve?
Right. These are great questions. And of course, this is important. You're right. I only spent about 2.5 or 3 pages in the book on defining capitalism. But of course, this is important. I mean, the argument is capitalism changes drastically over time, and it's very different in 1850 than it was in 1350. And it's also really, again, very different in the year 2025. But there's something that holds all of these different moments in the history of capitalism together. And what it is, I think, is not so much the existence of markets. Most people would say, okay, capitalism is a society in which markets structure economic life. I don't think that's really true, because markets have existed, as far as we know, in all human societies. And so they don't set capitalism apart. But what sets capitalism apart is that the economic logic of capitalism is driven by the productive investment of capital with the goal of further growth of that capital, in further accumulation. And to make this possible, so this is the prime kind of condition of capitalism, and to make this possible, there need to be markets, there need to be the inputs to production you need to be able to acquire them on markets, you need to be able to purchase them, and also there need to be markets, you need to be able to sell the things that come out of your factories or workshops or other such things. And then there needs to be the possibility to employ or recruit labor. So there needs to be commodification of inputs and outputs to make it more abstract, and there needs to be also commodification of labor power. So this is, I think, all the forms of capitalism that we encounter in the book, from the 1150 port of Aden to the textile factories of Cambodia in the year 2023. This is where the book ends. They all have that in common. And this logic now, as I said earlier, this logic is really a radical departure to how much of economic life on planet Earth has been structured in most of human history. So if you think about the merchants in the port of Aden in the year 1150, namely where the book starts. So these are people who control capital, and they buy goods. They try to buy them cheaply, and they ship them somewhere else, and they try to sell them for more money. And in that way, they grow their capital. They accumulate their capital. They have more capital then to invest yet in other undertakings. And sometimes, even in the year 1150, they not only trade in things, but they also put some money into production. So they run, for example, the Yemenite merchants run a factory on the other side of the Indian Ocean, on what today is the western coast of India. So this is, even though this is almost 900 years ago, this is strikingly modern. We understand right away, we understand intuitively what these merchants did, which is kind of striking, right? But at the time that these merchants lived, in the year 1150, most people on planet Earth were totally confused as to how they organized their economic lives, and they often hated that. They if you think about all of the world's main religions, were very dubious about that kind of economic life, and they had often very strong prohibitions about engaging in these kinds of activities, because most people on planet Earth. Most people engaged in kind of subsistence agriculture. They produced the things that they consumed. So they grew food, rice or potatoes or wheat or other such things. They went out hunting. They collected berries. And they also manufactured the things that they consumed. Let's say clothing, they manufactured that at home and consumed it themselves. Or if they traded it, they just exchanged it with their neighbors, but they didn't trade it halfway around the world. So this was how most people organized their economic lives. And then, of course, there were those people who became fabulously wealthy. I mean, just, when you travel to Europe today, you see all these magnificent castles and churches and all of that. Where did this come from? It came from some people having a lot of people under their control and coercing them to labor, and also coercing them to part with some of the things that they produced so that they were able to accumulate wealth. So wealth itself is not particular to capitalism. There have been wealthy people also in non-capitalist societies. But the logic of becoming wealthy in capitalism is radically different from how most people in the past understood what it meant to become wealthy. And so in a way, so just imagine now, you have this word, let's say in the year 1150, and there are very few islands of capital, very few islands in which these merchants that I described earlier kind of practice their business. They are a total minority in the world at large. And now compare that to the world today. Today, the logic that these merchants 900 years exemplified, it structures almost everything we do. I mean, not just our economic activities, but even our social lives, our way of thinking about the world, everything. And so the book basically explains how this particular logic, this strange, weird, revolutionary logic, how that spread in human societies in the past 900 years or 1,000 years.
Yeah, that linkage between we recognize it immediately as a distinctive, like, yes, that's familiar, even though it's in a different time, is very I don't want to say startling, but you kind of notice it right away from the beginning. Now, there's something really interesting here in the beginning, 12, 13, 14 centuries, is that you mentioned that a lot of the world's, what we'll say, capitalists at the time, they didn't travel with their goods, but they traded from a distance, right? And that they were able to deploy capital to produce more capital. I want to expand on that a little bit. So generally, that's the idea. But one of the things you do nicely, which I think a lot of people, obviously people within these fields do this, but at large, is understanding how, I always say that of the three major religions, Islam is still the new kid on the block, right? 7th century, et cetera. But in the Muslim world, you saw a lot of this, and you give this a lot of time in the beginning of capital has this these emergent nodes in the Islamic world. Baghdad, Aleppo, Cairo, Alexandria, they had some of the largest markets in the world. So, there's all these communities and guilds, but talk about how in the Islamic world, many of these major cities that are very ancient, even before the, kind of the 12th century, were doing this trading from a distance, and how they were kind of using that. Obviously, India has also, Dharimpool, has his new book out on the Golden Road, and how that has also been a huge factor for the rest of the so-called Middle East and the Mediterranean, Europe by proxy. So, yeah, how is this trading from a distance from these places such a key marker in the early kind of quote-unquote stages of capitalism?
Right. Look, I mean, so much of our thinking about, if we think about the history of capitalism, if we understand that capitalism is not the natural order of things, but is something historical, then most people, for good reasons, start thinking about places such as Florence, Genoa, Venice, maybe Amsterdam, maybe the city of London, maybe New York City. So it's basically a story that is about very few parts of the world. It's about Europe, and then maybe also later, much later, about the newly emerging United States. This book radically departs from this narrative because it argues that capitalism was born global and can only be understood from a global perspective. And one of the ways how I showed that capitalism is not just a kind of story about Europe and maybe North America is by showing that these islands of capital that I mentioned earlier that emerged in the first half of the second millennium, they emerged in many, many different parts of the world. They emerged in Aden, as we already discussed. They emerged in the cities that you mentioned, Cairo, Baghdad, Aleppo. They emerged in Guangzhou in China. They emerged in various parts of the South Asian continent. They emerged in West Africa. on, both below the Sahara and above the Sahara. Nodes of that capital also existed in pre-colonial times on the American continent. So this is a kind of a global development. It's not peculiar to just Europe, and it's also not peculiar to one particular religion, and it's certainly not peculiar to Protestantism, because this is way before the emergence of Protestantism in the first place. But if you would push me to say, where's the center of this word in the first half of the second millennium? Where is kind of what is kind of the New York City of the 12th century? It is clearly the Islamic word. The Islamic word sits at the center of these trade connections into Europe. It sits in the center of the trade connections, through North Africa, but then also West Africa and along the eastern coast of Africa. It sits at the center of the trade connections to South Asia, and it sits at the center of trade connections to China. And now, these merchants now start to trade at a distance, as you remarked. They don't travel with their goods. I mean, people have traveled with their goods since times immemorial, but these merchants, they kind of stay put. They stay in Baghdad, they stay in Cairo, but they trade with people several thousand miles away. And in order to be able to do so, they need to create certain kinds of institutions. They need to be able, for example, to move their money across very large distances. They need to somehow make sure that the person who actually transports these goods is actually going to return with the money and not just disappear. They need to make sure that if the ship sinks, that somehow they can recover their losses. They might need more capital than they have in order to equip a particular voyage, and so there needs to be a credit market where they can acquire that capital to able to fund a particular voyage. So what you need is institutions, and these economic institutions that become so very important to the long history of capitalism into the present day. These institutions emerge out of this trading network of the first half of the second millennium, and many of them come out of the Islamic world and then travel up to the southern Europe and elsewhere in the world.
Yeah, it's a very valuable point to state that this is as the book is indicating, is a global kind of piece. It's not a European or American only or derived from there, which I think is absolutely critical. As European capital begins to explode, you have these two kind of thesis points that I thought were really interesting. Again, I don't know if they're novel to you or just a clarity in which you explained it, but two pieces is we a lot of the times make with capital or capitalism this emphasis on private institutions. We still do that today. We highlight the private sector and all these things. But you make the claim that or the observation that private institutions were backed by state power in Europe and elsewhere. That's one point. And the second point, kind of close by, that you make is that capitalism was born in the countryside. It was these capital-rich elites and folks within the countryside. And you talk about examples from Italy and Spain and Portugal and the Dutch and the English. So yeah, tell us, expand on this, because this really was in the first third or quarter of the book what jumped off the page for me. I was like, oh wow. So yeah, develop that for us.
No, I'm happy to hear that you saw that, and in some ways that is kind of jarring, because if most people, and myself in the past, when I thought about capitalism, what do you think about? You think about smokestacks, you think about the Pittsburgh steel mills, maybe you think about Wall Street. Mm-hmm. And you think about urban places, you think about cities. I mean, all the cities that we have already mentioned, from Cairo to Florence to Amsterdam to New York City and so on. But cities do matter a great deal to the history of capitalism. Sure. I mean, these merchants, these islands of capital tend to be, they are always urban places. So it's not like that cities don't matter. But when capitalism expands, and when its dynamic is pushed from the dynamic of just trade into the dynamic of producing things, it of course goes first to where almost everybody lives on planet Earth, namely in the countryside. And it goes into the industries that almost everybody on planet Earth engages with, namely growing food or growing fiber. And it's indeed, it's like well into the 19th century before we can say that capitalism is really firmly rooted in cities and firmly rooted in industry. Before that, we see the transformation of agriculture, we see the transformation of the countryside. In a whole variety of places, we see how the Cairo merchants pushed the growing of flax into the Nile Delta. We see how the merchants of Florence pushed the growing of olives for olive oil, or the growing of wool into the nearby countryside, the Tuscany, or into the faraway countryside, such as Spain, where a lot of sheep were raised. Or we see then also dramatically how the countryside of the Americas was radically transformed through the importation of slave labor and the production of commodities for European markets. So a lot of this history. And I think this continues, and even today, I think the countryside is really quite important. And one of the things that this book really tries to do is to have us think about the countryside. Again, today, I think only 1% of all Americans are involved in the growing of food. So most of your listeners are probably not farmers and do not grow food. But this is truly exceptional in human history. It's only 20 years ago or so that the majority of people on planet Earth did not work in agriculture anymore. So we need to understand that much of human history was different from the United States as it is today. And then your second point, which is also really important and also goes counter to how often we think about capitalism. Because people often think about capitalism as somehow, the opposite of the state. I mean, there are people who believe, and I think this is quite common, that the more you have a powerful state, the less you have capitalism, and the less state you have, the more capitalism you have. That's a very common trope, especially in the United States. I think this book shows decisively that the capitalism is unimaginable without the state. And the growth of the state and the expansion of capitalism went hand in hand throughout its hundreds of years of history. And
could you give an example of how it's kind of inexplicably linked together, the state and the private sector?
I mean, in very basic ways, the state, we talked about these institutions earlier that are so important to the history of capitalism. Of course, these institutions are regularly and typically backed up by the state. Like, for example, private property rights they are kind of meaningless if they are not enforced in some ways. And it's, of course, the state who plays a crucial role in enforcing these property rights, or, insurance contracts, or the regulation of markets. From medieval times, it are always backed by institutions of the state. But then you see, in more modern times, you see, for example, the colonial expansion of European powers, which is so important to the history of capitalism. This is, of course, a story that is also about global investments, but it's first and foremost a story about, European military power being spread in other parts of the world. If you think about infrastructures, canal buildings, railroads, later roads, all of that is deeply linked to the state. When you see, in the 20th century, for the first time, you have a massive working class, people who are not anymore working in the countryside, but who are living in cities, working in factories. And this introduces a new political element into capitalist societies, but it also includes new kinds of social tensions. And here states play an overwhelmingly important role in, forging the welfare state, creating labor law and regulations that somehow address the kind of social turmoil that comes with the emergence of a massive working class. So wherever you look, you see the state in capitalism. And if you kind of draw a graph that would plot the increase in the size and scale of the state and the kind of spread of the capitalist logic into society, I think they would almost be parallel. It is unimaginable. The capitalism without the state is unimaginable. I actually think, and I argue that in the book, that capitalism is, probably the most statist economic civilization of any. And this is, of course, counter to how many people think about capitalism.
Yeah, it sounds like as you scale up on that y-axis, the x-axis is also increasing as well. It's almost like there's a kind of a big convergence there, where it's like, yes, as one is doing well, one is kind of linked with the other, which is fascinating. The other big piece, other big section. I mean, again, we're talking about the themes here. I mean, of course, there's so much rich data in the book, but a major theme that comes out a large part of the middle of the book is, kind of what I asked in the beginning, is we get the slave trade, right? And we're talking now 17th, 18th, 19th centuries. And how just, you don't have to give me the history of the slave trade, but just how does the slave trade and the development of plantations, we're creating wealth, or some people, I should say, are generating wealth from slavery that becomes this massive industry around the world, right? I mean, you talked about it in many different places, but we were having lots of different products. We were having tobacco, cotton, sugar, using slave labor from plantations in the U.S., but even in the industrial age, or the dawn of the industrial age in Brazil, we know, with coffee, and Brazil was obviously the last major country to abolish slavery in 1888. So all the way almost into the 20th century, we're seeing the use of, again, this is not horrible wage labor. This is slavery. I mean, people are bought and treated less than animals. I mean, this is their property. How do we understand that a lot of the things that, I mean, maybe is it too fine a point to say that what pushed us in from an agrarian to an industrial kind of world was plantations and slave labor and all these things generating wealth? Could we have done all of these things? Again, I know this is the could. I know you're reporting the what happened, but I was reading it and I was like, yeah, could that have happened? Could we have had all of the materials produced without all of that? I mean, it's such an interesting alternative history, I guess. But yeah, just talk about the primacy of slave trade and plantation use for many, many centuries in the U.S. and in other parts of the Caribbean and other parts of the world.
Look, in the end, we can't tell if capitalism could have unfolded in radically different ways and maybe could have unfolded without slavery. I don't have a good answer to that question. But what I know historically, slavery has been extremely important to the expansion and emergence of global capitalism. And I think we can think of it in two particular ways and at two particular moments in time. So if we go to the kind of early history of capitalism, let's say in the late 15th and and then in the 16th century and 17th centuries. We see these islands of capital. We see these powerful communities of merchants that now, in one part of the world, namely in Europe, build a strong coalition with these European states. And that allows them now to expand into other regions of the world. The problem of these merchants is that it's hard to make use of their capital because the European countryside is so deeply structured by feudal relations, is so deeply structured by these coercive exploitations that we have discussed earlier, that it's not that easy to kind of recast European agriculture or European production, for example. But now they arrive in the Americas, where the resistance that they face from indigenous people is significant, but is overcome by the kind of coalition of state power and the power of these early capitalists. And there, they now reinvent agriculture from scratch. They build a form of agriculture that is unlike any other agriculture ever invented around the world. And what they do is they take the land, they take the land from indigenous people, and they import enslaved workers. And this now allows them to build a kind of perfectly capitalist society, because here all inputs, as we discussed earlier, all inputs can be bought on markets. You can buy the land, you can buy the implements you need to produce sugar or other such things. You can even buy the labor in order to produce these things. And that now allows massive amounts of capital to move into production. And that, of course, sets then the economy of the Americas in motion, but it also sets the European economy in motion in all kinds of distinct ways. So this is, I think, the first way. It kind of, slavery enables capital owners to overcome some of the barriers that they have faced in the past. This revolutionary logic of economic life can now jump into production, not on a small scale, but on a massive scale. That's number one. And then number two is, at a much later point in the 19th century, in the first half of the 19th century, we see the emergence of modern industry, especially cotton textiles, in the United Kingdom, but also in France, in Germany, in Italy, in Belgium, and in the United States as well. And what this means is that suddenly there is a need for much greater inputs to maintain that kind of industrial society. And the inputs are both, to feed the working class. So like all that sugar, basically feeds the British working class. And then you also need the raw material that goes into production, namely cotton, raw cotton. All of that comes from the Americas. In the case of cotton, it comes from the United States. And all of that is basically produced by enslaved labor. And indeed, more enslaved people are transported from Africa to the Americas after the Industrial Revolution than before the Industrial Revolution. So often we think, capitalism is really just the opposite of slavery. So in a way, capitalism helps us overcome slavery. And this is not totally wrong. I think there is something to that. But in this particular moment in the history of capitalism, when it becomes industrial for the first time, it is enabled to make that transition because it rests on the continuous exploitation of enslaved workers, and especially the sugar production in the Caribbean and Brazil, and the cotton production in the United States.
As we're in the industrial age and going into the 20th century, something that I have sort of loosely thought about, but it was just nice to see the history of this is, okay, post-slavery, if you will, slavery is, we've abolished slavery, okay, we're in the, the 20th century now. There becomes, capital, as you mentioned, becomes reconstructed, and it's globalized now, and it's, we're very much in an industrial age, and it's interesting that we talk about these things all the time in everyday kind of language, but it's sometimes we forget that these things haven't existed for a long time. So, for example, this development of, the emphasis on coal to use these things, that hasn't been around forever, at least not in the way we know it. And this idea of like a working class, I mean, it does seem that men, women, and children now are trying to work and contribute to GDP growth and finding these new forms of labor. So we don't have slave labor, anymore, but now we have wage labor, indentured servitude. We have tenant farming, family labor, all these things. But as we get into the 20th century, I was thinking about this again. Another does this connect of sorts? Like, would we have had in the 20th century, again, wars are a big piece of this, but a push for a welfare state if we didn't have people that were working with no labor laws, or they were indentured servants, or they were having, just these, horrific conditions. And I'm wondering, this development in the 20th century, as we go from industrial and then eventually to digital after that, but in this period, late 19th, early 20th century, of a working class and of wage labor and all these things, and the connection that has with a kind of welfare state, which we see today, and definitely in Western Europe, sort of kind of in the US. How does that, how do we see those kinds of linkage there?
No, these are really important points. And that, I think, also points to another argument that I'm trying to make. The book is very much kind of an actor-centric history, right? I write about, these merchants in aid, and I write about the plantation owners in the Caribbean. I write about these industrialists in Pittsburgh or Manchester or elsewhere. So it's not the kind of abstract, meditation on capitalism, but it's a history of people forging the word, forging capitalism, and changing it along the way. And one of the arguments that I'm making is that it's not just the rich and powerful who created the outlines of modern capitalism, but it's also, regular people. I mean, everybody from the wage workers that you mentioned who played such an important role in bringing about the welfare state that makes our lives now so much better than in the past. But also, I, for example, writing some detail about the enslaved workers of Haiti, of Saint-Domingue, who rebelled against, slavery and launched a revolution that does away with slavery on Haiti, and thus leads to one of the most substantial transformations in global capitalism. So the least powerful often, have an impact on the shape of capitalism that is quite surprising, I think, to many readers. Now with wage work, you're absolutely right. We take this for granted. I mean, almost all of us go out and work for wages. Our children are going to go and work for wages. We think this is like the air we breathe. This is just a fact of nature. But as this book shows, this is actually one of the most radical innovations in the history of capitalism. In much of human history, there's always been some wage labor. But in much of human history, almost nobody worked for the wages. And when wage labor became more prevalent, like in the wake of the Industrial Revolution, people were really reluctant to engage in it. They didn't want to engage in it. They thought of it as a form of dependence that took away their freedom. They even spoke about it. When I talk about the emergence of modern industry in Scotland, I find people who talk about it as a form of imprisonment. Yes, and people don't want to end up as wage laborers, and they run away from it. And for example, when the Republican Party in the United States is founded in the 1850s, they are very worried about wage labor. They think wage labor kind of undermines the republic because it takes away the kind of sense of property independence that a citizen of the republic does need to have. And so, this is still in the mid-19th century, wage labor is rather exceptional on planet Earth. And now, obviously, almost everybody engages in wage labor. What transition is more important and more meaningful than this one? That this is like a really radical one, but also one that we often don't see. And then your point about fossil fuels, that is, of course, also important. Until the 19th century, until the early 19th century, fossil fuels play almost no role in the history of capitalism. It's completely marginal. The exploitation of coerced labor plays a big role, but fossil fuels play almost no role. But then, all the productivity gains that come after the 1800s, all the growth in economic output is directly correlated to the ever more intense use of fossil fuels. And so, the kind of environmental issues that we're facing today is directly related to the capitalist revolution as well.
Yeah, it's very interesting how, like everything, as we get to the 20th century, we just see this sort of things start to become faster. And now in the 21st century, with globalization, with the digital space, everything is very, very fast. So I guess two kind of final questions here for the current moment. One is recessions. We've had many recessions in a capitalist society, and the big one was 2008. And I think as we've gotten further away from it, we're a solid 17 years away from it now, we recognize that in some ways it probably was worse than the crash of 29. Massive. Obviously, we had a type of recession after the pandemic in 2020. I keep hearing about this impending coming recession that we're all going to get, which is, I keep hearing about that. I mean, how do these become just in a capitalist society, just a part of capitalist living? Like we're going to have them and we have to deal with them, and we just hope they're not too big. How have we kind of got like used to that? I mean, maybe just briefly talk about that piece.
No, I mean, capitalism and stability are contradiction in terms. People think capitalism is conservative, but it's just the opposite. It's the most revolutionary change in human life ever emerged and was ever created. So yes, economic crises are just part of the entire history of capitalism from the beginnings to today, and presumably they will be part of the history of capitalism into the future as well. It's capitalism is a kind of revolutionary economic order, and it kind of constantly invents and reinvents itself, and it does. And I think the secret to the dynamic of capitalism is that it's largely undogmatic. Unlike most people who write about capitalism, capitalism itself is quite undogmatic. And that allows a kind of constant combination and recombination of different parts of the world and different forms of labor and different forms of political organization. And of course, this is also creating then, at fairly regular intervals, economic crises. Now, I think this is I think a very true observation that 2008, in retrospect, might seem more significant than it seemed to us at the moment when it happened. Mm-hmm. I mean, it was pretty dramatic when it happened.
Sure. Yeah.
And how I see that significance of the crisis of 2008 is also kind of shifting. It's always, in some ways, it's always most difficult to understand the moment in which you are living in at the moment. It's, in a way, it's much easier to understand distant history because you kind of know how it turned out, but we don't know how the present moment is going to turn out. But one thing that I observe in writing the history of capitalism is that change is not continuous. Change is kind of clustered at particular moments in time, and then when we get from one cluster to the next cluster, there is a relative stability. And we saw in the 1970s, we saw the kind of post-war Great Society economic order, the Keynesian economic order. We saw that coming to an end, and something new emerged. And I think what emerged there is what I call the neoliberal order, which was quite fundamentally different to what came before. And in a way, I would think that the moment we are living in right now is when this order is coming to an end. It's kind of, we are living again in a moment of transition, and something else is emerging. We don't know what exactly this is going to be. That is hard to predict, though some of the outlines of it are visible. But I think we are entering a very different moment in the history of capitalism, and we do so just like in other moments of the history of capitalism when we kind of move from one order to the next, because there was a kind of sense of crisis that the old order just didn't work anymore, and 2008 I think was very much part of that, but also the skyrocketing inequality, the dire environmental effects of what we've been doing in the past 50 years. I think all of that is coming into view. But so this is a more kind of structural problem of the neoliberal order, but then we also have movements that are deeply opposed to the neoliberal order, and these movements came from the left. Think about the Seattle protest, the protests in France against pension reforms and other such things. But they also very much came from the right, namely the rise of populist movements today. So I think it's a mixture of the kind of crises that you mentioned, for example, 2008, and then the political movements of the left and the right that have really weakened the neoliberal order and probably brought it to an end. And we are in the process of creating something new. And again, I think the book should help you think about this moment as well, because what I think it does, it tells you that we're not powerless. We shape the future. There are different trajectories. There was another major economic crisis in the 20th century, namely 1929, and there were different possibilities on the horizon. There was the kind of liberal democratic way of the United States or Great Britain, but much of the world turned fascist at this moment. So there were two plausible trajectories out of this crisis. And fortunately, the liberal one won out at this particular moment. So I think it's helpful to think about where we are right now in those terms as well.
Absolutely, yeah, I firmly agree. Last question here: wealth and income inequality is a thing we've been talking about for 15 years, kind of in a more general kind of the society, and we have many oligarchical states or actors or players or quasi-oligarchical. And you mentioned throughout the book, 1848 was a big year for revolutions economically, and obviously left and right populism is popular, at least politically. I mean, is wealth and income inequality the worst it's been now historically than at any other point? I mean, it's been pretty bad in other times as well. But I guess what makes it such a continuously problem, this kind of crony capitalism, which we don't want, that continues to live and to thrive, and it is to our detriment. How do we understand it within a historical context of kind of as a major thing we discuss now with capitalism, and I guess just generally, kind of what you're saying, where do you see the future of capitalism?
Right. I mean, look, inequality is not an invention of capitalism, so to speak.
Sure.
There has been very significant inequality in many moments in human history, including many moments before the advent of capitalism. In capitalism itself, there have, of course, also been moments of stark inequality, and often people cite the Gilded Age, the 1870s, 1880s, as one other example for that. But I think scholars have shown that the current moment of inequality in the United States, especially, is really quite extraordinary. It's at least at the level it was in the 1890s, and maybe it even exceeds that. And of course, that has huge implications, not just for economic life, though it does have important implications for economic life as well. But it also has huge implications for our political life, and so we can also see in the history of capitalism, however, that there are moments when inequality really declined quite significantly. And this was in particular the case during the 1940s, 50s, and 60s in the United States, but also elsewhere, when the enormous productivity gains that came out of the reorganization of production in the wake of the New Deal and World War II, when they were broadly distributed throughout American society. And what is happening now is that we have, not quite as significant productivity increases, but we do have productivity increases. We are able to produce ever more. We increase our economic output ever more. But what we don't do is to distribute this additional output broadly within society. It's really a teeny tiny minority of people who capture almost all of these productivity gains. Yeah. And, there seems to be something in the logic of capitalism that brings that about. So capitalism, just left to its own devices, is producing that kind of stark inequality. But we just need to look into history to see that there are ways to address that and to redistribute some of the enormous wealth that we produce. And I think this book also should alert you to the fact that throughout much of human history, people just weren't able to produce enough to create a decent standard of living, access to education, access to healthcare for everybody. But now we do. Okay, this is an amazing accomplishment, which we should in some ways celebrate. I mean, it does have environmental consequences that we also need to address, but still, we have a capacity to produce that nobody in the United States would have to go hungry or not have access to excellent education or have access to excellent healthcare. We can provide that. We have the means of doing it. And so it's just a choice that we don't do this. And maybe we should harvest some of the energy of the capitalist revolution of the past couple of hundred years to make that happen.
Yeah, no, I firmly agree. Sven, this is such a wonderful conversation. I appreciate you giving your time, energy, and wisdom. Your book is a masterpiece. It is absolutely superb. So thanks for writing it. Thanks for coming on and sharing all about it. And keep writing on this stuff. We need folks like you with your wisdom.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me on your program. Thank you.